Okay, so we've planted our seed, it started to sprout, or we've got a clone from either one of your existing plants or maybe from a friend, or you've purchased it on the market and that has rooted, and so we start to get some growth happening. So the first true leaves with a sprouted plant are what's called opposite oriented single leaflets. So basically you have your stem and then you have two leaflets coming out of the sides of it, and they're directly opposite each other on the stem. And you can see on this picture here that the leaflets kind of are completely opposite of each other. You can notice on other plants where the leaves will be alternate, where they come up on sort of different places on the stem, but with cannabis they come up completely opposite from each other. After that comes up about 10 centimeters or less above those seed leaves, which are called cotyledons. Then you'll get more leaves start to come up, and they might be various shapes that will come up, and they will get fuller as the plant sort of grows out and comes out a little bit. So a common pattern is that the second set of leaves that come up will have 3 leaflets, the third might have 5, and then you may even have 9 or 11 or even 13 leaflets as you come up, and that will depend on the genetics of the plant. The usual is about 5 to 7 around there, but different strains may have more or may have less as well. So under the right conditions, your cannabis is going to grow up to 5 meters in a season, and a season is somewhere around 4 to 6 months. If you're growing indoors or in big commercial grow operations, they can kind of force that growth through a little bit faster. But just for home grow, or if you're growing them outside, you need to allow a good 4 to 6 months for the plant to mature, and it will get quite big. So 5 meters is quite a big plant. They're not called nicknamed weed for nothing. They do, under the right conditions, they will grow like a weed in ditches or in fields and things like that. So cultivation for cannabis requires that each plant gives each plant more room. So if we're growing for medicine, we want to have lots of room for that plant to, first of all, get really tall. Maybe if you're growing for medicine or for cannabinoids, you might not reach that 5 meter, but certainly you might, get to 1 or even 2 meters tall. And you want lots of room for that plant to be really bushy. So it needs both space height and it needs space around it as well in order to have lots of room. So if the plant feels crowded, the growth will be stunted quite a bit and you won't get as good a quality. Now, if you're cultivating for textile, so you're growing hemp, the hemp-based plant for textile, for seeds, or to press the oil out of these seeds, you want those really tall plants. And then they can be planted quite close together. And those are usually done in a farmer's field. So they'd almost be planted like a wheat field or canola field or oat field, those kinds of things. They're planted very close together, and especially for textiles, you want that plant to be nice and tall. For textiles, having that tall plant is really important because you have those nice long fibers that can be broken down and then woven into fabric for making clothing and textiles, those kinds of things. So if you're growing for medicine, you want to give lots of room. Plants are really spaced out. If you're growing more for textiles or for food, they can be much closer together, and but they're going to grow up quite tall, so you're going to need lots of space for them to grow tall. There's a few stages that the plant will go through. Of course, there's first the seedling stage. After the seedling stage that we talked about, it goes into what's called the vegetative stage, and that's where the plant is just producing lots of leaves, lots of vegetation. It's growing in height, it's growing in width, it gets little branches and leaves. It can get quite dense after that. This is the stage that will last about 2 to 3 months, and this is basically setting up the foundation for the plant to have enough energy in order to create the flowers and the medicine that we're really ultimately looking for. If you are juicing the plant or wanting to juice the plant, you may want quite a bit of that vegetative stage so that you always have lots of leaves that you can throw through a juicer. We will be talking a little more in depth in another lesson about juicing the cannabis plant, but just know that there are times when you really want to encourage that vegetative state, and you do want it to be really healthy during this time, because then it will have lots of energy that actually it can produce those cannabinoids and the terpenes that we want in the finished product. So the most vigorous growth of vegetative growth will happen as the days get longer, so increasing light. So if you're growing under artificial light, when it reaches that vegetative stage, so it's kind of out of the seedling stage and it's really starting to come up with new leaves every few days or so, it's getting quite bushy, that's when we want to give it lots of light during the daytime. And it's going to depend on the strain and your growing conditions that you have. So if you're growing outdoors, that means that you want it to kind of come into that vegetative state somewhere in June, like late May, June, and July kind of time, because that's the time when we have, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, that's when we have the longest daylight hours. Under the right conditions, your plant is just going to grow like crazy. You could put up to 10 centimeters on the plant daily. So it will be some noticeable growth that you know that you have the right conditions. You've got good moisture, you've got good nutrients, it's got lots of room to sort of grow and expand, and you're getting a good amount of light, nice long days with lots of bright light. After the flowering stage, or after the vegetative stage, we move into what's called the flowering stage, and that's when the plant starts to set up flowers. The flowers will start to set up as the daylight gets less. So as the days get shorter, the plant's going to go, oh, wintertime must be coming soon, so I better start putting up seeds. I better stop all this growth and start setting some flowers up, because the plant thinks that it's going to get pollinated and grow some seeds so that it can throw the seeds down for next year. But of course, we're not going to pollinate that plant. But this is when the daylight hours start to get a little bit less. So if you are growing outdoors in the Northern Hemisphere, it becomes quite noticeable as we get into August. The days start to shorten up a little bit, and certainly as we get into September, the days, it becomes quite noticeable. The days just aren't as long. And we might start to get even into September. By late September, we start to get those equal day and night. So if you're growing indoors, you would want to set up your light system to kind of mimic that a little bit. So really nice long days of lighted period where you have the lights on during that vegetative growth. And then when you want it to start setting up flower, you think that it's sturdy and healthy and big enough to set up some good healthy flowers, then you would start to shorten the time that you have those lights turned on. There is something called an auto-flower genetics that is out there. The auto-flowering plant comes from the rutialis strain, which we talked about as being kind of like that scrappy cousin. Remember that we had the the cannabis sativa and the cannabis indica. And then we had the other strain called the rutialis. And so the rutialis, they don't really know where it came from or why it split off from the other two. Some think that it sort of kind of split off from the original plants and ended up sort of high in the mountaintop. So it had to be a little bit hardier in order to grow. And what happens with the rutialis is it's called an auto-flowering plant. So it doesn't care if the days are long or the days are short or how much sunlight it's getting. It's just going to start to set up seeds or set up flowers when it starts to set up flowers. So some of those genetics from the rutialis or the auto-flowering plant are starting to be bred into some of the seeds and strains that we can grow at home, which makes it a little bit easier, because then we don't have to fuss with the light system as much if we're growing it in a basement or using artificial lights. It just makes it a little bit easier to grow. So I think we'll see a lot more autoflower genetics on the market for home growth. And certainly some of the licensed producers or some of the commercial growers are starting to use some of those genetics with autoflowering. Just makes makes growing it a little bit easier. The plant's not so fussy about how much light and dark periods there are. So we've gone through the seedling stage, we went through the vegetative stage where it's really growing, sometimes up to 10 centimeters a day. Then we get some beautiful flowers starting to set up, and then this is when the plant is starting to mature, and we'll start to see those trichomes really start to come out on the buds and the flowers, and you'll get that sort of shimmery crystal-like look to your plants, at least on the flowers and the fan leaf parts as well. When grown outdoors, we talked about, can take 6 and even up to 8 months to reach maturity. So if you happen to live in an area where you have, quite long summers, so you have a lot of days without frost, say 120, 130 days without frost, then you start your seedlings indoor and you plant them out as soon as you're past the first dangers of frost. In some areas of Canada, that could be even into April sometime. In some areas of Canada, it's not till, late June before there's no frost happening. But in any case, it can take 6 to 8 months to reach maturity. When we're under controlled conditions, so in a greenhouse, or if you're growing it in your own basement or in a tent that you can get, you can manipulate the plant so that it comes to maturity in as little as 3 months, so about 90 days. So you can see there's quite a wide variation in there, which allows different types of growing in different climates and different conditions as well. All right, let's talk about how you determine the sex of the cannabis plant. So we talked a little bit earlier about why it's really important to have a female cannabis plant if you're growing it for its medicinal qualities, because we don't want any seeds in there. So we want to cull out or get rid of any male plants. If you're taking clones from a mother plant that you know is a female plant, you don't have to worry about that. That for sure is going to be a female plant. If you're growing from feminized seeds, most likely you're going to have a feminized plant. If you don't know if the seed's been feminized or not, it's probably a 50-50 chance you're going to get a male plant and a female plant. So there's a couple of points in the growing cycle where we can determine whether it's a male or a female plant. So in the first 4 to 6 weeks of growth before it starts to flower, then there's some signs that we'll look at in a minute. And just as the bud starts to form, that's when we'll know for sure whether it's a female plant or not. There is a type of chemical sexing of the plant that can be done as early as 1 week from germination, so even just those tiny little seedlings, but that can be expensive and it can take 3 to 4 weeks to get the results. So you may as well just leave your little seedling alone and wait those 3 or 4 weeks until you just be able to visually see whether it is a male or a female plant. Okay, so this picture will really show you, or this little diagram starts to help you see the difference. So you see on the female side there, it's got those there's like a little ball, and then it's got those little hair-like stigmas that come up. We were talking about what that was a moment ago. And then on the other side there, you see there's just they almost look like little tiny seeds, and that would be the male plant. So you see there's no little hair-like projections coming out of that little ball that looks like a seed. So that's the difference, male versus female. For the female, you're looking for those little stigmas that come out, those little hair-like, and you'll get 2 out of each of those little tiny buds that are there. They will grow between the nodes. So remember, that's where the stalk and a branch or a leaf starts to come out. That's right in that area. That's where you'll get the sexual parts starting to come out. The female cannabis plant obviously is going to go on to produce flowers. The male plant will go on to produce pollen sacs that will eventually open up and then just spread the pollen into the air. Cannabis is what's called a wind-pollinated plant, so they don't rely on insects to sort of fly flower to flower. It does require some sort of wind or movement of the air around the plant so that the pollen from the male plant gets kind of swept through with the wind past the female flowers. That is if we want to grow seeds for it. So here's a really great picture of the female flower, or the cannabis flower, really starting to set up. And you see all of those little white stigmas that are showing up there. That's your indication that a flower is going to form at each of those areas. So 2 stigmas for every little flower that you're going to get there. The stigmas are usually white, but sometimes they kind of like a creamy color, or they can be a little more yellowish, or they could even be a little bit pinkish. Sometimes you'll get other colors coming in there as well. But that's your true indication that your flowers are starting to form, is when you see those the stigmas starting to show up like that. On this picture here, we see the male pollen sacs. So they're kind of shaped like a spade. So you can see they're sort of rounded at the bottom, and they have a little bit of a pointy top on them. These will start to appear about 3 to 4 weeks after germination. You may not be able to see them with a naked eye at first. You may need to take like a little glass or a magnifying glass or something and get up close to them. The other indication that is a male plant is that little bud there, or that pollen sac, will be on a tiny little stem, and we can see it in this picture here that there's a little stem attached to it as it goes into the node of the plant. So that's another indication. Of course, as the plant matures and gets a little bit bigger, that pollen sac will become more visible to the naked eye. You won't need a magnifying glass to see it. So here's another look at the male pollen sacs there, a little bit closer up, a couple of different views of that. And you can really see on the one picture there, you can really see how it's quite a spade shape. So really quite rounded in the bottom with kind of a pointy tip on it as well. And so here's comparing the male one there that doesn't have the stigma sticking out, and then on the other side you see those white hair-like projections coming out. Those are the stigma. That is definitely a female plant. The ones without the stigma is definitely a male plant. So those are the areas there. There's one other thing that can happen, which is hermaphrodite, or some growers will call it, oh, my plant hermied. That just means that some weird thing happened and your plant became both male and female at the same time. So it has both sex organs on the same plant, which is unusual. It occasionally happens. Nobody really knows why, but it will happen. So hemp grown for fiber has actually been bred to be like that, to have both male and female parts on the same plant. That is called a monoecious. And as we talked about earlier, if we have a plant that has both just a male plant and a female plant, that's dioecious. So the hemp that has been genetically altered in order to be hermaphrodite, that does make a more consistent product if you are growing for textiles or for food. And so let's take a look here at the difference between the male, the female, and the hermaphrodite plant. And we can clearly see the male plant has no stigmas. The female plant has the 2 stigmas coming out, and the hermaphrodite, you can see both the pollen sac and a stigma coming out of that as well. And there we've got it circled there. So just one last thing about the sex of plants. When it's grown to produce medicine or recreational purposes, really the male plants, as we said earlier, they are removed or called out, or at least moved to a completely enclosed area. If you're outdoor growing, you have to put that plant into an enclosed space, so a tent or something like that. If you're indoor growing, you would move it to a completely separate room and ensure that the air flow from that room, if you're going to be producing pollen, isn't going to be flowing into the rest of your greenhouse. So even if that happens, even if you have the plant isolated and that pollen gets into the air system, you can still cause a problem in the rest of your greenhouse. And of course, we talked about how fertilized seeds or fertilized plants just create an inferior product. You're going to get seeds with that. And one other term to know is sensimilia, which is another word that means without seeds. So female plants that are grown in a controlled environment without a male plant, sometimes you'll hear growers referring to them as sensimilia plants, which just means without seeds. They don't have any seeds.